loud.
Okay, ethicist. Only when we know a lot about the events that led to an action are we justified in praising or blaming a person for that action, as we sometimes are. We must therefore reject Tolstoy's rash claim that if we knew a lot about the events leading up to an action, we would cease to regard that action as freely performed.
Okay, so what is our conclusion here?
That we must reject T's rash claim.
That if we knew a lot about the events leading up to any action, we would cease to regard the action as freely performed. And why is the ethicist saying that?
Because it's saying that because they're saying that only when we know a lot about the events, like, are we justified in like praising or blaming a person.
Yeah. So only when we know about only when we know what like led to this event are we allowed to praise or blame the person for doing that thing. And so then we jump from that to then saying we must reject his claim that if we knew a lot about the events, it's no longer that, or we would cease to regard that action as freely performed. So what is the word they use? What is the new variable that this conclusion introduces?
Freely perform.
Yeah. Where does this come from anywhere?
I think that that's why this really caught me up, because I was like, how does like this conclusion relate? Like, I just really missed like how those two you know what I mean? How those two
Yeah.
things were related. I was very confused. Well, that's probably the point, because that's what the question.
Yeah, so it is, and it's a sufficient assumption, right? So we know there's a gap here, and sometimes I could see like this being more challenging because like I don't even see how they're related. But once we have sufficient assumption, we know our goal is to guarantee this conclusion. So it's like a super strengthened question. So bare minimum, what we want to do is bring in something that guarantees our conclusion. The true strategy, which you probably have been told before, is like you have to connect the gap, right, between our premises and our conclusion. If you're struggling to do that, just treat it like a super strengthened question. But why must we reject the claim that if we knew a lot of events, we would cease to regard the action as freely performed? Like, why must that be true?
I guess now thinking about it this way, and we could say that for an action to be regarded as freely well,
So we're saying that we would not. Okay, so wait, I have to read. Okay, so T's claim is if we know a lot about events leading to an action, we would not regard it as freely performed. So we're essentially trying to say like this actually is freely performed because we're rejecting that. So maybe why must we reject, like, maybe
I'm not kidding. Like, I sat and looked at this question for a very long time.
if we knew a lot about the events leading up to it, we would not regard the action as maybe even maybe like nothing, every single, I mean this is really bad, but every single action is freely performed no matter what. Like, that sounds silly, but that technically would work, right? All right, so let's go ahead and start with A.
People should not be regarded as subject to praise or blame for actions that were caused by conditions beyond their control.
I don't think that has anything to do with
The conclusion.
yeah, like us rejecting this claim. Like we're not saying that people should or should not be subject to praise or blame. And we don't even talk about things being above, like without, like were caused by conditions beyond their control. Like even if this is true, yet people should not be subject to praise for things outside of their control. Therefore, we need to reject this claim. Like that does nothing for us.
Mm-hmm.
And should is very mild too, just FYI. All right, what about B?
Whether an act is one for which the person doing it is genuinely responsible is not determined by how much information others possess about that act.
Whether an act is one for which the person doing.
I don't really think that this works because we're not really talking about responsibility. Like,
Yeah, and responsibility isn't the same thing as freely performed.
mm-hmm.
So whether an act for the person doing the act is generally responsible is not determined by how much information others possess. Yeah, and it's not. Yeah, and it talks about others possess. Yeah, so like yeah, very bad answer actually. It's just very wordy. All right, what about C?
We can be justified in praising or blaming a person for an action only when we regard that action as freely performed. I mean, I'm kind of feeling like this might be the right answer because it kind of connects our, like, kind of our premise to the conclusion.
Yeah, because what happens if so if we're justified in praising, I'm just going to use praising instead of blaming. So justified in praising, what is necessary for that? If we said freely performed, and if nothing could be freely performed, then what does that mean? It can't be justified. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that at least tells us that we have to reject this. That like because we're saying that no, only when we know it can we be justified in praise. And if you're trying to say that these actions can't be freely performed, well then how can they be justified about praise ever?
Yeah, I feel like this one's right, but I just am not getting my head around
Okay.
it.
Let's go ahead and skip it. So let's say that this question's hard. I know that it at least is bringing in the right variables. So we like it and we don't see how it works, but we're okay. Let's see if we can cross the other ones off to at least give ourselves a chance to get it right.
Okay. The responsibility a person bears for an action is not a matter of degree. However, our inclination to blame or praise whoever performed the action varies with the amount of information available. That's the one that I picked, but obviously it's wrong.
Okay, so why is it wrong though? Sorry, I'm moving to the other room, but why is that one wrong?
Um, I think now looking at it, it's because it's talking about like the responsibility a person bears for an action,
Yeah,
because we're not even talking about like responsibility. The idea that something's freely performed doesn't have to include like responsibility.
right. And then it comes in like our inclination to blame or praise people who perform the action varies with the amount of like cool. So if I'm going to praise or if I'm going to praise you, it's going to depend about how much information that I have. That has nothing to do with this action being freely performed. We really have to have an answer that brings in this new variable.
Okay.
All right. And then what about E?
If we do not know much about the events leading up to a given action, we will regard that action as freely performed. Hmm. I feel like that's wrong.
Yeah, if we do not know much about this is talking about what happens when we do not know much of it. So whenever we don't know a lot, then the action is freely performed. Cool. But does that mean that does that mean that we can't like what about when we do know a lot? Do we know anything? No. And so that it's not connecting it for us because in our situation, we do know a lot about the events that led to the action. And so that would be the difference between C and E too.
And it doesn't even bring in the element of like just like praising or blaming an action.
Right. But if it did say like if we like I would say yeah, because like that's where for C it brings in praising and blaming versus saying like when we know a lot about an action. So that's how this connects it.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So at least we could get to it by process of elimination.
Yeah, that was just a really hard, my, like, sometimes like your brain just like can't comprehend